A child sits in the back seat of a car, happily eating a fast food hamburger. 3 days later, her internal organs violently shut down. She is rushed to the emergency room, bleeding from the inside. Her parents beg the doctors for a cure, but the medical staff is entirely helpless. The weapon that killed her wasn't hidden in the dark. It was handed to her through a brightly lit drive-thru window. In 1993, the American drive-thru was a symbol of absolute convenience. Fast food was cheap, hot, and highly predictable. Families trusted the brightly colored restaurants lining their local highways. Jack in the Box was a massive, aggressive player in the industry. To crush their competition, they launched a heavily funded marketing campaign. They called it the Monster Burger. It was advertised as a massive, juicy mountain of beef at a highly discounted price. The promotion was a massive financial triumph. The restaurants were instantly flooded with hungry customers, cars wrapped entirely around the buildings waiting for their cheap meals. Inside the cramped kitchens, teenage employees were completely overwhelmed. The metal grills were packed edge to edge with raw beef patties. To keep up with the massive demand, the cooking process was rapidly accelerated. They didn't have time to let the meat sit. It had to be fast. It had to be incredibly juicy to match the commercial. But deep inside that raw meat, a microscopic killer was silently waiting. In early January, pediatric hospitals in Seattle, Washington began to notice a terrifying anomaly. Parents were rushing their young children into emergency rooms in the middle of the night. The symptoms did not look like standard food poisoning. The children were suffering from severe, bloody diarrhea. They were screaming and agonizing abdominal pain. Within hours, their skin turned pale, and they became completely lethargic. Doctors were initially baffled. They administered standard antibiotics, expecting the bacteria to clear, but the medication did exactly the opposite. It made the situation infinitely worse. When the antibiotics attacked the bacteria, the dying cells violently ruptured. They released a massive flood of lethal toxins directly into the children's bloodstreams. The children's kidneys were rapidly failing. The medical staff realized they were dealing with something incredibly rare and deeply violent. It was hemolytic uremic syndrome, or HUS. The red blood cells were being actively destroyed by the toxins. The tiny blood vessels inside their kidneys were becoming completely clogged with debris. The children were literally drowning in their own toxic fluids. Dialysis machines were frantically rushed into the pediatric wards. Nurses worked around the clock, hooking tiny bodies up to massive humming machines, but the numbers just kept climbing. 10 children, then 50, then over 100. It was a localized epidemic, and it was moving at a terrifying speed. Epidemiologists from the Washington Health Department scrambled to find the source. They interviewed exhausted, terrified parents in the hospital waiting rooms. They asked them to recount every single thing their children had eaten in the last week. A chilling, undeniable pattern quickly emerged from the data. Almost every single sick child had recently eaten a hamburger. Specifically, they had eaten at Jack in the Box. The health department immediately raided the local restaurants. They confiscated the frozen meat patties sitting in the walk-in freezers. The lab results were absolutely devastating. The beef was heavily contaminated with E. coli 157H7. This is not a normal stomach bug. It is a highly aggressive, deeply mutated strain of bacteria that lives in the intestine of cattle. When a cow is slaughtered carelessly at a massive packing, fecal matter mixes directly into the raw beef. With a solid steak, this isn't a deadly problem. The bacteria only sits on the outside of the meat. The hot grill burns it away instantly on contact. But hamburgers are completely different. Ground beef takes meat from hundreds of different cows, chops it up, and mixes it all together. The contaminated outside is folded directly into the inside. One infected cow can contaminate thousands of pounds of meat in a single factory run. The invisible killer is pushed deep into the absolute center of the patty. You cannot wash it off. You cannot smell it. You cannot taste it. There is only one way to kill E. coli 157H7. You have to cook the meat until the internal temperature reaches exactly 155 degrees Fahrenheit. The intense heat physically destroys the cell walls of the bacteria, But the Jack in the Box outbreak wasn't just a tragic accident. It was the direct result of a calculated corporate policy. Months before the outbreak, the state of Washington had legally mandated that all burgers must be cooked to 155 degrees. Health inspectors knew the extreme danger was out there, but Jack in the Box executives ignored the new state law. They kept their official grilling manuals at an outdated, illegal 140 degrees. They argued that cooking the meat longer made it tough, dry, and less appealing. They wanted the monster burger to be fast, cheap, and juicy. They traded basic human safety for a better-tasting product. Cases like this don't just expose corporate greed, they shatter the illusion of public safety. And if exposing the dark truth is why you watch, subscribe to Evidence Zero, because the fallout from those undercooked burgers was about to claim innocent lives. The human cost of that corporate decision was staggering. Over 700 people were violently sickened across 4 different states, but the bacteria did not affect everyone equally. A healthy adult stomach can often fight off the infection with a few days of sickness. A child's immune system is completely defenseless. The bacteria targets the young with absolute ruthlessness. A young girl named Lauren Rudolph was one of the very first victims. She ate a hamburger at a franchise in Southern California. Days later, she suffered 3 massive heart attacks in the hospital. She died in her mother's arms just after Christmas. She was only 6 years old. A 9-year-old girl named Brianne Kinner ate a burger in Seattle. The toxins attacked her brain, throwing her into a deep coma for 40 days. Her internal organs shut down so completely that her parents were told to plan her funeral. She miraculously woke up, but she had to completely relearn how to walk and talk. But the absolute horror of the outbreak wasn't limited to the people who ate the meat. E. coli 0157H7 is highly contagious. It can spread from person to person through microscopic physical contact. A 16-month-old toddler named Riley Detweiler never ate a Jack in the Box hamburger. He was far too young for fast food, but his parents dropped him off at a local daycare center. He played on the floor with another child whose parents had bought them a contaminated burger days earlier. The bacteria transferred between the children on a simple plastic toy. Riley spent weeks in the pediatric intensive care unit. His tiny body was hooked to dozens of plastic tubes and humming monitors. His parents sat by his bed, completely helpless as the toxins actively destroyed his brain. Riley did not survive. In total, 4 children were killed by the outbreak. 171 people required emergency hospitalization. Dozens of children suffered permanent, lifelong kidney. Their lives were completely altered by a $2 fast. The public backlash was swift and violent. Jack in the Box was brought to a sudden grinding halt. Their national sales plummeted straight into the ground. Their corporate stock was crushed overnight. Protesters stood outside the empty restaurants with heavy signs warning parents to stay away. The company's initial response was a masterclass in corporate deflection. They immediately called press and tried to blame the meat suppliers. They tried to point the finger at the slaughterhouses for sending them dirty beef, but the internal corporate memos eventually leaked to the press. The documents proved the executives knew about the 155-degree cooking law. They were explicitly warned about the exact dangers of undercooked meat, and they deliberately chose to ignore it. They were forced into massive class-action lawsuits. The company eventually paid out over $50 million in legal settlement. It was the largest food poisoning payout in American history at the time, but writing a massive corporate check did not bring the children back. The Jack in the Box outbreak fundamentally terrified the American government. It exposed a massive, glaring hole in the national food safety. Meat inspection laws in 1993 were still relying on outdated techniques developed in the 1920s. Government inspectors were literally just smelling and looking at the meat to see if it was spoiled. You cannot see E. coli. You cannot smell it. It is an entirely invisible killer. The tragic deaths of those 4 children forced an absolute revolution in the meat industry. The government officially classified E. coli 0157H7 as an illegal adulterant in ground beef. It became a severe federal crime to sell it. Entire slaughterhouse testing procedures were violently overhauled overnight. Fast food chains across the entire globe completely changed their cooking process. They threw out their old manuals and installed heavy digital thermometers on every grill. They fired teenage line cooks who rushed the grilling process. The phrase "cook until well done" became a permanent, non-negotiable rule in every commercial kitchen in the country. The fast food industry was forced to respect the invisible danger hiding in the beef. The laws were rewritten to ensure the public would never be poisoned on this scale again. They changed the temperature, they changed the inspection. But for the parents who handed their kids a bag through a car window, the meal never ended.